coincidence.
So, welcome everyone to our webinar on Bridging Gaps, a conversation between disability, intersex, and trans activists. My name is Leila. I am the membership coordinator at AWID. And just before we begin, I want to give a few brief technicalities and information about how to use the platform. So, you have been joined by either microphone or telephone. All participants' microphones will be muted, just so we can avoid a lot of background noise. You will be able, though, to post questions in the questions box. Some of you have already discovered that part. It's at the bottom where it says questions, and you just please feel free at any point to enter any questions for our panelists or any comments. We will be collecting those, and then our panelists will be addressing them. The webinar is being recorded, so for those who couldn't attend, they can listen to it afterwards, or for those of you who would like to listen to it again, we will be sending it out. And then engaging, if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtags Bodily Freedoms and AWID Forum to tweet away. And at the end, we will launch a survey that we would please ask you to fill out. It's not very long, it just takes a couple of minutes, and it really, really helps us with organizing future webinars. And for those of you who are not members, we would be happy if you join us. You can find that information on our website at awid.org. And for any other questions, delayed responses, comments, please feel free to email us at membership@awid.org. Yes, and just a quick note that it's an amazing amount of participants that will be joining us today. They come from 8 regions in 36 countries. Some of those include Cameroon, Egypt, Fiji, India, Mexico, Russia, and Mauritius. So now I will give the mic away to Nidhi Goyal, who will be our moderator for this session.
Thank you, Leila. A very good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on wherever you are, to all of you. I'm Nidhi Goyal, and I would like to really welcome you to this conversation on bridging the gaps, a conversation with all of us working on disability rights, trans rights, and intersex rights. Why? So this is a part 2 of the Bodily Integrity and Freedoms series that we have. AWID has been focusing on, so one of the key umbrella themes and an umbrella session at the AWID Forum 2016 very shortly, which is in September, in a couple of weeks, is on bodily integrity and freedoms. Why have we chosen this theme, and why do we want to bridge the gaps? Is body in all our movements, in the women's rights, in each of our movements, has been sort of, for us, a very key site, a point of contestation, a point of control, the way norms and standards were established around that. Basically, our struggles and movements have always weaved around the body. Having said that, body was viewed largely as something to be medicalized, something to be pathologized, something which is fixed, which was certain. It is only now that we view body in different cultures, in different contexts, as an identity, more as a concept than pathology, more fluid than rigid. It's really today, when we talk about lifting the control, when we talk about establishing autonomy, it is more about representing what is possible. What are the opportunities with us around our bodies and our autonomy? So when we talk about bodily integrity, and particularly in the form of freedoms and movements, we basically wanted to bring together, and that's what AWID wanted to do, was to bring together key actors, organizations, activists, individuals, and movements. And that is where the idea of bridging the gap. So each one of us belong to a different movement, or rather belong to multiple movements maybe. And we have our own sort of struggles, we have our own intersections where we are struggling. So for example, women with disabilities are maybe traversing at a point just within the intersection of their identity between the women's rights movement and the disability rights movement, trying constantly to find a foothold, a link that connects the two movements. For basically from all our movements that we're going to talk about today, from bridging the gaps, what would this movement or inter-movement dialogue mean to us? Why do we need to include it into bodily integrity? Is because when we in our movements, particularly the ones that we're addressing today, when we talk about bodily freedoms, it's not only breaking one kind of control, it's not only challenging one kind of power structure, it is actually struggling against multiple power structures. So structures of ableism, structures of sexism, structures of normativity, structures which really force you to fit and to belong. So we look at bodily integrity and bodily freedoms in a slightly different way. Maybe the disabled women look at it, or women with disabilities look at it more from the freedom of medicalization. Intersex people are struggling with the correction, the quote-unquote correction that makes them fit into the binary. Or maybe the trans people who want to sort of talk more about the choice that is seldom given to them on who do they want to be. In such a space, what we'd like to do today by having this inter-movement dialogue and establishing linkages is to understand the challenges and struggles that either pull us down, or the opportunities and possibilities that keep us going. Or even within other movements that we're not talking about today, in particular, like the movement of the sex workers, the queer movement, etc., or the anti-race movements. Are we still struggling with these questions of mainstream women's rights movement and then the marginalized women's rights movements, right? So I think just here today will be a fabulous conversation with many sort of brilliant people with their learnings and obviously the valuable input that you bring in through your questions to talk really about intersections and intermovements, to really bring and include the richness of learnings from these movements. The way we will proceed is with every panelist. I would invite each panelist now to give their introductions, to introduce themselves, and also to introduce a little about their movements. So may I please start with Leanne?
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. I will start by saying, my name is Leanne van der Merwe. I am a trans woman. I'm based in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, which is also known as the former homelands during the apartheid time. This is the context that we take with us throughout, our work. We started, as a collection of trans feminists work on issues, pertaining to violence and issues of the body. Our work has been centered a lot around Eastern Cape provinces, South Africa, but we also conduct research at the national level, and we also give input, to advocacy processes at the regional level. So, that's a little bit of my work. Our movements intersect very much, with the sex worker movement. many of the trans women that we work with, are either former sex worker or currently identify as sex worker. We also intersect a lot with the HIV movement, and when we started our work, we intersected very much with women's sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Okay. Leanne?
Hello?
Yeah. Would you like to continue a bit about your movement? You have a couple of minutes more about the trans movement as a movement, sort of an introduction to the trans movement.
Thank you very much. So when we started out in the movement, the focus was really, I won't say the focus was on trans men, but, from where we were, trans men predominantly, and, those are the individuals who are assigned and go through life, the sense of, a masculine gender identity, or they are gender non-conforming, not identifying as male and not identifying as female. And so, trans women really had to come to the table, given all the social issues that affected us, the unemployment as an economic issue, the invisibility of trans women within the regional movement, violence against women, is a conversation that was a lot around heterosexual women, women in marriages to men. It was not about queer women, and, slowly that discourse is starting to change. We intersect very much with the sex worker movement, as I said before, because many trans women do sex work, but not just in the context of the economy, but also, as a way of gender affirmation, which has direct bearing on the issue of body and bodily integrity and body freedoms, what trans women can and cannot do. I want to touch on one very particular point. If you look at Africa, there are very little choices around the broader context of sexual and reproductive health rights, because we have 2 public healthcare hospitals in South Africa that offer gender affirming surgery, but both waiting lists are stretches well into 20 years. That for me is around the choice. So the choice is still lying with the medical establishment about how I can or when I can feminize my body.
Okay. Great. Leanne, thank you very much. I think you really sort of set the stage for taking some of the key conversations ahead and touched very briefly on choice, on regional movements, on economics, and I'm sure we'll take some of these conversations ahead. Could I please now request Janet Price, Janet, to give your brief introduction and to talk about the movement of women with disabilities.
Janet, you are mute if you're speaking.
Janet, you're still on mute.
Unmuting, that's much more helpful. Sorry about that. Right, no. I will start again. Great. Yeah, I'm Janet. I'm based in Liverpool, UK. And when we're talking about movements that we belong to, I actually, over the years, have sort of been part of, I think, 3 different movements that I would focus. I've been a feminist for over 40 years now. I came out as a lesbian, as a queer woman, 32 years back. And I've been a disabled woman for about 25 years. So my politics, my identity, my ways of being in the world, and the groups that I have worked with politically have shifted and changed over time. I've also worked very closely over the years with feminist groups and rights-based groups, sexual rights-based groups in India. Really, for the last 30, 40 years, that's been an intrinsic part of my life and my history. I wanted just to give a little bit of a background to the way that disability is seen, because I think this is really the sort of key part of where we need to think about some of the intersections today. And some of the ways in which disability has been understood. I think one of the standard ways that lots of people approach disability, and that I've experienced a lot in my life, I've got a thing called multiple sclerosis, which affects my neurological system. And that's involved me very much with the medics along the way. And disability is seen very much as this. It's seen as something that you go to the doctor with, they will mend or solve whatever the pathology is. They're the heroes in this. And even if they can't mend it, they can make your body look as close to normal as possible. So it's really a normative game. How close to normal can you appear? And I think that's possibly something it would be interesting to talk about with the others here, because I think that's a battle around pathologization that all of us face. For disabled people, of course, there's also the charitable side of it, the welfare and pity that get heaped upon people. And I think one of our challenges in trying to establish links with other movements is that some of that notion of us as a group deserving pity is still there. They don't necessarily see disability as a political movement, and I think that's one of the things that really needs to change, and that's as much the part of disabled people getting the message out there about the politics as it is about people coming to stand that. Now, one of the big things happening in the disability movement is that very influential, because it says disability is caused by society. It's about the fact that society doesn't provide ramps, it doesn't provide sign language, it doesn't do audio description, it institutionalizes vast numbers of disabled people, it causes stigma and discrimination. But that model also says disability is nothing to do with the body. Now, that's a really big problem for me as a feminist. You know, they're saying you have to change society, not the body. So what do I then do with this bit of me if I'm fighting as a disabled woman? And I think that's led many disabled women to feel uncomfortable with a lot of the mainstream disability rights movement, and to begin to think more in terms of a dynamic relationship between the body and society. So to understand that the one changes the other, like I can talk about a bit more later. But within this, of course, then the UN Convention on Rights for People with Disabilities has come in very powerfully. But and all of these movements are in political battle. We see it all as being about stigma, discrimination and prejudice. But I think, just to finish briefly, I want to say that disability politics faces, for me as a woman and as a queer woman, I face a lot of problems. It's massively male dominated. They've just voted 11 out of 12 of the UN committee as men. So there's only one woman represented. Disability.
Everything okay?
Ok? Estão me ouvindo?
Yes, Janet, please go on.
It's frozen.
Janet, you were just summing up your last thought.
Nidhi, looks like Janet has either lost connection.
Okay, so I will finish one of the things that she was saying, is because I know exactly the statement that she was talking about. At a very recent election of the Committee on CRPD, so there is a Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the committee has voted only for one woman amongst many other men. So there is no equal representation. So what does that mean even now, after the convention having a special article, after we talking about women with disabilities and the movement getting stronger? It is, so as a moderator, I switch to being a moderator now. It really sort of draws parallels with what Leanne said. And I'm going to continuously draw links because Leanne also said that it was all about trans men. And that is another challenge that the disability movement highlights as well. And since Janet has sort of got disconnected temporarily, to continue the disability thought, Morgan, I'll come to you in a bit, but let me move on to Adriana. Adriana, could you introduce yourself and your translator? And the movement from anthropology and disability.
Ok. Em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de dizer que é um prazer imenso estar aqui com todos vocês.
I'm really happy to be here with you.
Agradecer essa oportunidade desse webinar em partilhar informações a respeito dessas interlocuções, desses movimentos tão complexos.
And we thank you for the opportunity to take part of this webinar and share information about the movements in this so complex situation.
E, em especial, partilhar com a Janet, que é uma pessoa que eu leio a respeito de estudos de deficiência há muitos anos, e uma pessoa que admiro muito.
And especially to share with Janet, that is a person that I read quite a long time and that I study a lot.
E dizer que aqui no Brasil eu coordeno a pesquisa em deficiência e acessibilidade na Associação Brasileira de Antropologia.
Here in Brazil, I coordinate the research on disability at the National Association of Anthropology.
E na Associação Brasileira de Pesquisadores em Ciências Sociais.
And at Brazilian Association of Social Science Researchers.
O que engloba antropologia, sociologia, ciência política e relações internacionais.
What involves anthropology, science, and the international relationship.
E ciência política, né?
And political science.
E são 119 programas de pós-graduação.
It's about 119 programs of graduation that I coordinate.
E eu coordeno duas ONGs, né? Uma que se volta para mulheres com deficiência, na busca de direitos sexuais e reprodutivos e combate à violência de gênero.
And I coordinate also two ONGs. One of them that fights for the rights of the human, for sexual and reproductive rights, and combat violence affecting women with disabilities.
E a outra que cuida de pessoas com doenças raras. Né?
And another one that take care of people with rare diseases.
Eu tenho uma doença rara, na verdade eu tenho 13 doenças raras, mas a mais importante é a doença dos ossos de vidro. Né?
I have 13 rare diseases, but the most important is the called vitral bones.
Né, o que me fez já ter mais de 300 fraturas e 32 cirurgias.
What made me more than 300 breaks, and more than 32 surgeries.
Então eu sou antropóloga, né, com formação em antropologia pela Unicamp, né, e tenho um grupo de mais de 50 pesquisadores comigo.
I'm an anthropologist and I graduated at Unicamp and I have more than 50 researchers working with me now.
E é um prazer muito grande estar aqui hoje para ter essa interlocução com vocês.
And it's really nice to be here with you to take part of this interlocution.
Great. Adriana, thank you so much to both of you. And I just want to ask you a quick question here that we learned from your introduction, your areas of work, etc. If I could request you to talk a little more about either the disability movement, or what I would really be interested in if you spoke about the movement that takes or pushes the issues of people having rare and terminal and long-term diseases or illnesses. If you spoke a little about that, how have you seen the movement, the organizing, etc., even if it's national, regional, at whichever level, if you share a little bit, it'll be really great.
Bem, em primeiro lugar, os movimentos da pessoa com deficiência, dos transgêneros e dos intersexos, eles vivem, cada um deles, uma questão muito específica, que é o da biosociabilidade, que é um termo utilizado pelo Rabinow em 1999.
So, first of all, each one of these movements, the movements for people with disability persons, transgenders, and intersex, they live a question, a specific question that is related with their biosociability. That is a point worked by Rabinow.
Ou seja, são movimentos onde as pessoas se aproximam por condições corpóreas, farmacêuticas, de histórias biológicas. Então, as pessoas se aproximam muito mais por condições de embodiment, de corpo, do que por condições de classe ou de raça, por exemplo.
So these are movements where people get together because of bodily conditions, much more than class conditions or race or other sort of issues.
Há também a semelhança da questão do desconforto corporal, de uma história de ableism, de uma história de capacitismo. Ableism é traduzido em português por capacitismo. É uma história de desconforto corporal, de estigmas corporal, de marcas corporais muito fortes e de uma discriminação muito forte. Porque, no limite, né, todas as discriminações elas são interconectadas. Então, todas as pessoas sofrem uma discriminação, uma narrativa social que considera os corpos delas menos humanos, menos importantes.
So there is also a strong history about their bodies, about the marks of their body, and how they build their narratives related to these conditions, and how they face discrimination because of their bodies.
Essa narrativa a respeito do corpo torna um desconforto corporal, e eu acho que eu estou te deixando pouco tempo para traduzir, desculpa. Faz com que a relação com o corpo seja muito pesada nos seus movimentos.
So this creates a sort of quite discomfortable relation with the body, what is quite hard to face.
Né? Ou seja, há uma fixação permanente, né? Uma under construction, uma construção muito pesada, uma construção política muito pesada de opressão sobre o corpo.
So there is a quite hard political building about the body.
E também uma construção muito pesada de invalidez sobre esse corpo, né?
And also a quite hard building about the inviability of this body.
E acho que uma outra questão que também há sobre esses corpos, né, é a questão de que à medida que esses corpos são inválidos, são discriminados, são malditos, né? Há uma questão de maldizer esse corpo. O Brasil é um país muito religioso, temos passado por um momento extremamente conservador.
So, there is also a sort of people don't speak well about their body, and Brazil now faces a quite difficult situation with the religion that is quite strong now.
Okay, so sorry. Sorry, Adriana, if you just wrap up with the last thought, because we have a couple of questions that we need to push. Yeah, Adriana, you can sort of wrap up the introduction so that I have some follow-up questions for you in the next couple of rounds. So.
Veja,
have you
sim,
yeah.
Assim, tenho. Veja, há uma preocupação desses três movimentos, né, de se sentirem desejados, né? Há uma preocupação com a sexualidade muito forte.
So there is a concern. There is a concern about being desired, about the sexuality.
Então, por exemplo, o movimento da pessoa com deficiência tem a questão do devoti, né, devoteísmo, e o movimento transexual e intersexo tem um movimento de sexualidade muito forte. Mas esses movimentos de sexualidade são vistos como perversões. Né? A sociedade conservadora tende a ver o desejo sobre essas pessoas como perversão. Pronto.
But the society tends to see this desire for sexuality as a perversion.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think you've brought up a many very important points. The two highlights that I would sort of 2 points that I would highlight here, which will also come much more in our conversation forward, is this whole idea of being undesirable, being viewed as any kind of sexual desire, being viewed as perversion, on this self-hate of the body rather than love because of the way it's medicalized, the way it's viewed, the way political pressures, it functions within the political framework. So thank you very much. And with this, I think, Morgan, we open up for you. If you could introduce yourself, and you've seen some of the key things that we've highlighted, but also if you highlight from your movement that you belong to.
Thank you very much, Nida. Okay, so to start off with, I'm intersex, I have an intersex body, I'm queer, and non-binary. And like many intersex people, I've got a difficult personal surgical history and now lifelong hormone treatment due to the medicalization of an intersex trait. And I'm a co-chair of a national intersex organisation called OII Australia, and I'm the founder of a new small international project as well. I live in Sydney, Australia, and I work locally, nationally, and internationally. So the intersex movement has been active for about 20 years, focused initially on patient rights, and increasingly, and perhaps unevenly, on human rights. But intersex is still really quite misunderstood, and we're still perceived as the new kid on the block. We're poorly resourced as a movement, and we often don't have access to the spaces where we need and want to participate. So being here with you is really wonderful, and thank you for the opportunity. But what do I mean by intersex? I thought it might be useful to just give a little tiny bit of an introduction based upon some research carried out in Australia this year. And Leila, if we can start with the slides. Maybe the first slide. Okay. Where are we? Okay, here we are. Thank you, Leila.
Okay.
This is a definition of intersex by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Intersex people are born with sex characteristics that do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. So we're talking about a bodily issue from in terms of the definition of what intersex is. And intersex bodies can be very different. There are at least 35, 40 different intersex traits with different consequences. And it's important to recognize that we're very diverse in terms of how we see our bodies, how we see our genders, how we see our sexes. And we helped with an independent research study earlier this year, or last year, published this year, of 272 people born with atypical sex characteristics. What you can see on this slide is the diversity of sex assignments reported at birth, and gender identities now. So a small majority of people were assigned female at birth, and a small majority reports a gender of being a woman now. And we can see how 41% were assigned male at birth, 23% now have a male gender identity. And there are a range of other complexities and also different identities that people have. So what this says is that no, we're diverse. About a quarter of people have genders other than male or female. And there's no single one identity that suits all intersex people. Very quickly going on to a few more slides. You can see how around half of the people in the survey this year are heterosexual, and just a very small majority perhaps are non-heterosexual, depending on how we want to define that, including people who are asexual, people who prefer male, and people with a range of other identities, and people could choose multiple different categories. So we're more likely to transition the general population. We're also more likely to have a sexual orientation than the general population.
Okay.
And like other stigmatized populations, we have a lot of different ways of describing our physical characteristics. So 60% of people in the study use the word intersex to describe themselves. And other people will use, well, people will also use terms related to a specific medical diagnosis. People may use sex chromosomes, whether that's XX, XY, XXY, XO, other kinds of chromosomal variations. And small numbers of people will use medicalized language like disorder of sex development. And more people will use that language when talking to clinicians and trying to access medical services. What's important to note here is that many people will not see intersex as an identity label, but we'll talk about having an intersex variation or having an intersex condition. And then just to finish off, the survey also found strong evidence suggesting a pattern of institutionalized shaming and coercive medical treatment, with 60% of people receiving treatments on the basis of their sex characteristics and half at under 18 years of age. And the majority of people experience at least one negative impact from medical treatment. And we can also see very high numbers of people reporting pressure to conform to gender norms, including from institutions and from parents. And we also see very high rates of suicidality and suicide attempts. So there's some very significant issues. A lot of this is about the body. There's a colleague of mine called Dan Gattas who says that everywhere in the world, people with intersex bodies have been deemed incapable of integration into society. And I think that we share a lot in common with people with disabilities, a huge amount in common. In many cases, intersex may be regarded as a disability or may be regarded as a medical issue in exactly the same way. And we also share a lot in common with trans people in particular, because of our failure to meet sex and gender norms. And we also have strong connections to the child rights movement and to people with other forms of bodily diversity like albinism and dwarfism. And so far we've largely unexplored those points of convergence. That's a brief introduction, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Morgan. I think with your introduction and introduction to the movement, you also very, very smoothly have led us into the next segment that we really want to talk about in terms of points of convergence. Before that, I'd like to step back and just bring draw some common links talking about not only medicalization, which I think is a thread that's really running across, but very importantly, something that our earlier speakers said about the shame attached to the body. And it is amazing how people with disabilities, and now that you mentioned intersex persons, all of them are made to look at their bodies in a shameful way. One very important thing which I'd like to draw a parallel here to just move the conversation ahead is the thing that you mentioned about there being a lot of diversity within the group. So although we say it's trans persons, if you say it's intersex persons, if you say it's persons with disabilities, or or women, it's just not a homogeneous group, and that's something that we all face as challenges within our movements, and something to think of as we go ahead. So my next question to all of you is, what are the real points of convergence that you see with other movements, like some of the ones that Morgan highlighted? So Morgan, I'm again going to come back to you a little later because you've started some of the discussions. Is Janet back? Janet, are you here? No.
Am I
okay.
here?
So we.
Am I here?
Yes,
here?
Janet, you're here. So
yeah.
Yes,
Good.
yes.
Good. I'm here.
So can we
Good.
start with you, Janet, to talk about the points of convergence? Particularly because you said you already, with your sort of personal and political and activism, you have been a part of 3 movements very, very directly. So if you just talk a little about that.
Sure. Well, listening, I mean, it's been great listening to the other presentations, because I think what really came home strongly to me was so many points of convergence. I just kept thinking, yes, yes. So, but I think maybe to start with one of the points that all of us seem to be fighting against, and it's this focus on pathologization. All of us have this, real struggle with ways in which our bodies are put into medically confined norms, and we're expected to fit into certain norms. Listening to Morgan now talking about the way in which sex is assigned, because you have to be, don't you? Obviously, either male or female, and there are no other options. And the same way for disabled people, that you have to have a body that, as far as possible, will look, will move, will act as though you are normatively abled. And so disabled people are forced through horrendous forms of surgery, of physiotherapy, to actually try and make us appear as though we walk and move and speak in the same way as non-disabled people. And so I think those are very strong links for me. I think a second link that really struck me, and this I was listening to Leanne talking about this, was some of the discrimination we face around sexuality. And I think what people often don't recognize around disabled people is how much sexuality is a major battle for them, because people do not recognize us as having any form of sexuality. We're very often seen as either asexual or hypersexual. And I think there's a great deal of shame in the way that Morgan was talking about exploring our sexuality, and then in challenging anything but the heteronormative. So there's a growing queer movement which is challenging all of these limits. Cripping is to disability what queering has been to the gay community. It's that challenge of the norms at all levels. And I think that's opening up some really interesting possibilities of connection with the trans, the intersex, the women's rights movement at all sorts of levels. One of the things that I've noticed a lot in the work that I've been doing, and this has come up with a group I was working with in Malawi and in Kenya, and also in the work that Nidhi and I have been doing together in India, are the links of the disability movement, the very uncomfortable links that the disability movement has with disabled sex workers, both queer and straight. And there are quite a large number of disabled people out there working as sex workers. They work as sex workers because they've been rejected by their family and that's their option. They work as sex workers because it's an active choice that they go into and it's something that they see as a positive option for them. So there's a range of reasons, but I think it's something that really very few parts of the disability movement have explored at any level. And so I think there's a group who are really lacking in support, and that different groups need to be looking to reach and potentially to reach out to them. I think the sex worker movement, the disability movement, I think there's sort of connections and overlaps.
Okay, Janet,
shall I stop there?
Yeah, I'll just come back to you in a couple of minutes. I might have in this very round a couple of follow-up questions for some of the panelists, but you've actually touched something that we're also going to talk a little more in detail. So hold this thought about the discomfort with another movement, or discomfort of collaboration with another movement, because that's going to be a segment by itself. So thank you for those thoughts, Janet. I think you've sort of really drawn links for us together and highlighted this whole issue around sexuality, SRHR, pathologization, medicalization, and the body to be fitting from where we began. Leanne, can we move to you and hear some of your thoughts where points of convergence have been for you? Because this is really sort of, I think, where Janet left off around sex workers is where I think you would like to begin, because you mentioned that in your around trans women and sex workers and the intersections there and the movements there. So could you please share some more about points of convergence? Leanne?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Muting and unmuting this mic is a challenge for me, which is an indication of my technophobia. So, one definite point of conversion for trans women, and I will also speak a lot about my own narrative as a trans woman, is around, sex work and the issue of sex work, and how, trans women, I guess we'll get to the challenges, but, I want to talk about this, when we talk about convergence. I previously said that, trans women do sex work for many reasons, whether it's economy, whether it is gender affirmation as a framework. So one of the key challenges that stem from that have been, the accusation that, why trans women need to be doing sex work, why they need to be doing it, in the context of gender affirmation. There are so many things that they could do. So that's one issue for us. Around the discourse of HIV, that has become a very fiercely contested space, with international research and data starting to show the epidemiology around HIV infection in trans women. And so, some of that research has translated into funding decisions that are, that have become very contested. So the HIV movement, is currently dominated by, very much by the MSM movement, the men having sex with women movement, men having sex with men movement, I mean. And so, that has left out a big gap in terms of, getting funding to all the right people. Yeah? Another point of conversion in my particular work is among, the feminist movement and the women's movement. Our organization, as SHE, we've built ourselves on the politics of, facing similar struggles as other women. And I always make this example by saying, whenever I'm given the opportunity to speak publicly, prior to my transition, I was harassed for being a feminine boy, and post my transition, I was harassed simply for being a woman. And that intersects for me with the discourse around violence against women. What we've noticed in South Africa is that if you talk about violence against women already, that is caused, it's excluding so many people. It's excluding queer women, it's excluding trans women, it's excluding lesbian women. So while it is a point of conversion, it's also to be noted very much as a contested space.
I think you have really, really deepened the conversation, taken it also to another level. And it is very interesting that some of the points that Janet and you already presented around engaging with the sex workers movements, and I'd like you both to elaborate it in a bit when I come back to you around this sort of inter-movement work with sex workers, and what does that mean to you? Is it sort of because of compulsion to gender affirmation, or to prove a gender, or to sort of conform to a gender? Are we then saying that the choice of sex work does not remain a choice? Is it all to then say it's forced, or are we talking about two separate things where choice needs to be engaged with and force needs to be dealt with? Also, the very, very second important thing, and that, if Janet, I might come back to you on that, is the engagement with the feminist movement, and if you could talk a little more about that. In fact, I'll come back to you right now, so then we can then move to Morgan and Adriana. Is this engagement with the movement, and a very important thing that Leanne said, that first harassment was because of being feminine when the body was not, and then just woman. So, Janet, if you could sort of talk about these points of convergence for disabled women and the feminist movement briefly, that would be great, and then I could move on to Morgan.
Thanks, Nidhi, and thanks, Leanne. I mean, what struck me listening to you as you were talking about the violence you faced and the women who aren't perceived as properly women is that you can obviously add to that list disabled women as well. So there's a whole collection of this notion of conformity to be able to fit into the notion of perfection around womanhood. For women with disabilities, it's been a very interesting engagement with the women's movement, because clearly there's been a great desire to make that link. You know, many disabled women are feminists. Those like me who've become disabled during their lives and were feminists continue to be feminist. Other disabled women have been disabled from birth and go into their feminism as I did, non-disabled. But I think it's the understanding of the critiques of the body and how we live within and through our bodies that have been incredibly important to disabled women. But what's been enormously sad for us has been also the difficulties in finding a place within the women's movement. So we've drawn a lot on the ideas of feminism, of their advocacy around understanding the body, around body ownership and integrity, and that is and continues to be really crucial for disabled women. I think bodily integrity is something that we face such challenges about, and I really resonated when you were talking about the notion of shaming, Morgan, because I think that's something that disabled women or disabled people face so much. It's a very, very powerful force used against us that keeps us silent, keeps us in the corners of the world. And I think the potential for connection with the women's movement is very powerful, and you see it in all sorts of ways. You see it at the UN level, in the way that many disabled women, rather than going to the UN CRPD for resolution of issues they face, they go to CEDAW. They find much more satisfaction there because they have much more understanding of the types of issues that they're facing in their lives, violence, the discrimination. Very often they are that sense of being a woman intersecting with disability, and CEDAW somehow seems to get that in a way that the UNCRPD doesn't.
Fantastic. So with that thought, we will move to Morgan. Thank you very much, Janet, for your thoughts and linkages there. Morgan, if you could tell us what have been the points of convergence for you with other movements, and how has that journey been?
Thank you. Let me try not to jump too far ahead again by talking about a couple of the victories. But just to kind of recap points of convergence, I totally agree with what Janet has just said, that shaming is such a huge issue for us. It's partly an issue here about the othering of people with intersex bodies as being not real. For intersex women, it's about not being a real woman. For intersex men, it's about not being a real man. And I think that behind that talk, we can see some other issues that build upon other comments that people have been making about sexuality and desirability. And I think that intersex bodies are seen as either, in fantastic fantasy terms, or mythological, or unreal, imaginative ways that are not grounded in reality, and the actual reality of intersex bodies is completely different to the imagination. And I think that we can even see that this kind of distinction between reality and imagination, even in some of the earliest recorded words about intersex, going back 2,000 years, where intersex people were either gods or monsters or both at the same time. So that kind of has an impact on our relationships to our own bodies. It has an impact on how we are seen by society, because there is this kind of double view of intersex people and intersex bodies, because we're seen as being this kind of miraculous group of people that can destroy this gender binary, or that we combine the best of both worlds. And at the same time, those kinds of bodies call into question other people's sexual orientation. They call into question what it is to be a real man or a real woman. So where are we with that? Yeah, again, very strong links with what Janet is saying about the experience of medicalization, and very strong parallels to aspects of what Leanne has been talking about, in the sense that because we don't conform necessarily to sex and gender norms, whether that's visibly or conceptually, then we're seen as being a challenge. But there are also other issues that I think need to be, we need to kind of do better about. I mean, one of the, I won't talk about challenges yet, but there's so much more that we'd like to do in terms of exploring connections with the women's movement and with people with albinism, people with dwarfism, particularly in looking at the women's movement. There has been this experience, I think, certainly in Australia, of an othering, of saying that intersex women are maybe not real women, and the kinds of issues that people with intersex, the issues that intersex women face, are not issues that women face. So, for example, the genital mutilation of intersex women is not an issue for feminism. I would dispute that, and I know lots of other people in the intersex movement. But trying to get our issues understood, it's been one of the first barriers that we face. So maybe that's enough for now.
So I think it's really valuable, because all of you have not only drawn linkages, but you've spoken about potential linkages, spoken about some of the gaps, and really resonating with each other. So I think that's already a linkage for us within our movements that we're talking about, or the issues that we face. Something to also remember is or reflect a bit more is, are we, even the movements that are present here on the panel, thinking about the disabled trans person or the intersex person with another visible or invisible disability, or you know, the queer person who's disabled. So very many intersections that we need to keep in mind. And again, repeatedly, but the pathologization, the shame, being not something enough, so being not a woman enough. And I think that's really a very strong point of discontent, potential collaboration, etc. We will quickly move to Adriana, where, just to inform our panelists, we're 15 minutes behind schedule, of course, because of my sloppy moderation, but I thought we're really making important points so as to not cut them even shorter. Adriana, could we have your thoughts on points of convergence here? And then I'm actually going to combine the next two segments and ask everyone's thoughts again.
Veja, à medida que vocês foram falando,
As you talk,
várias situações foram passando pela minha mente a partir de dados de pesquisas minhas e de meus alunos e do meu grupo de pesquisa.
so several situations came to my mind with the dates that I have, with the research that I do with my students and my researchers.
Por exemplo, eu realizei um survey na cidade de Campinas com mulheres com deficiência em 2002.
For instance, I realized our research in 2012, 2012?
2002.
In 2002, with women in Campinas.
Nós localizamos que as mulheres com deficiência física e cegas são duas vezes mais abusadas sexualmente do que as mulheres sem deficiência.
We find out that the women with disability, as well the blind women, are 2 times more abused, sexually abused than the other women. Sorry.
As mulheres com surdez são 5 vezes mais abusadas.
The deaf women are 5 times more abused.
E as mulheres com deficiência intelectual são 9 vezes mais abusadas.
And the women with intellectual handicap are 9 times more abused.
90% das mulheres com deficiência intelectual no Brasil sofrem abuso sexual.
90% of the women with intellectual disease in Brazil suffer sexual abuse.
No Nordeste brasileiro, até a década de 90, 100% das mulheres com deficiência intelectual eram esterilizadas de modo forçado.
In the Brazilian Northeastern, 100% of the women with intellectual handicap were sterilized.
Nós fizemos um relatório para a convenção, né? Eu participei do relatório da convenção, a denúncia sobre a convenção para o Brasil. Eu escrevi uma parte do relatório relatando casos absurdos no Brasil.
We made a report for the convention relating really terrible cases in Brazil.
Mulheres com HIV/AIDS no Brasil, se elas têm deficiência, elas tendem a ter uma segunda e terceira deficiência.
Women with disability in Brazil, if they have AIDS, they have 2 or 3 more disabilities.
O que é um contrassenso, porque a grande maioria dos brasileiros com HIV e AIDS vive muito bem. Inclusive, o HIV e AIDS no Brasil hoje não tem mais, não tem tanto apelo a proteção, porque as pessoas vivem tão bem com o coquetel que muitos jovens nem querem mais se proteger. Então, nós temos dois extremos no Brasil. O jovem que não quer se proteger porque acha que o coquetel faz a pessoa viver bem, e a pessoa com deficiência, com HIV/AIDS, que vive com, às vezes, uma segunda e terceira deficiência.
What is quite contradictory in Brazil, as the health system really protect the person with AIDS, with HIV, and usually even the young people, they don't fear to take the disease anymore, not so much, because as they know that they will be protected by the health system. So you have this quite contradictory situation. In one point, people really well protected, and at the other point, people with disabilities that suffer from the second and third disability.
Okay. Mulheres com deficiência no Brasil dão à luz em presídios algemadas.
People with a disability in Brazil, they gave birth in prison, locked, in a really terrible situation.
Okay, so thank you very much. Adriana, we'll have to stop here if you finish your last point, because
Temos situações assim absolutamente terríveis. E eu acho que a nossa grande dificuldade aqui é que o feminismo ele já alcançou a academia, mas não alcançou os movimentos.
So we really live quite terrible situations here, and I think that the great difficulty is that the feminism reached already the academy, the universities, but not really the movements.
Correct. So on that thought, Adriana, I'm sorry, Adriana, we'll just have to stop here. Adriana, if you don't mind, we'll come back to you with the next set of questions, but I would really like to, sorry about that.
Eu vou concluir, que eu preciso só concluir, por favor.
Just one more.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Veja, o feminismo na pessoa com deficiência é muito difícil ainda. As mulheres com deficiência não se veem como mulheres. Sequer se veem como pessoas, mas não se veem como mulheres. Não se empoderaram como mulheres, como seres sexuais empoderados. Isso está muito distante, muitíssimo distante. Não há discussão sobre aborto, não há discussão sobre empoderamento corporal. Essa questão ainda é muito distante. Então, eu acho que essa é a grande dificuldade para fazer um verdadeiro relacionamento com o movimento lésbico, com o movimento intersexo.
So the problem is because feminism with the disability person is quite difficult because they don't see themselves as women. It's quite difficult a discussion about abortion, about sexuality. So this gap should be seen because it's a quite hard situation. This relationship between feminism and the movement of persons with disability.
Okay, that's great. You've led us right into our next segment, which talks about, I keep calling it next, but I think it'll have to be the final segment, where I'd like you to highlight two things. This difficulty of, or the challenges, or the debates, or the differences when you try to do inter-movement collaboration or work. So the classic example that Adriana has now given here, which is also very topical and timely, is about abortion rights and disability rights. So the sexual rights movement that talks about abortion and the disability and sexuality movement. So where is that intersecting? Or the other difficulties around sex worker movements and women with disabilities, or trans women and sex worker movements. So some of the frictions in collaborating with the movements would be fantastic to hear from the panelists. Just one thing that I'd like to again draw an attention to, that violence is coming up again in a big way. So when you say lack of choice, when you say lack of autonomy, when you're saying force, it is already violence, but there is a lot of active violence in action, violence in thought, violence in denial of spaces is also something that we've really, really seen. Violence is not accepting identity. And why I'm highlighting all of this is because it runs across all what our panelists have shared. So not conforming to being woman enough, or being the right woman, or being the right person, or having the right identity, or not fitting into a box. So I think that's really important for us to think as well, because then who are we really valuing within our movements really comes up strongly. So this could be a challenge or friction between your movement and any other movement that you belong to or don't belong to and try to work within. With that, I'd also like you to weave in where you've seen victories or some positive, an example of how you sort of overcome, or the positives that have come up in these inter-movement collaborations. And we'll start with Leanne here. Leanne, would you like to go first? And I'd request everyone to keep it to 3 minutes each, Leanne, so really tight on time. Sorry about that.
That's okay, thank you. So, in response to the question, I will list some few positive examples where we have worked with women's groups or other groups. We know that, the issue of sex work is criminalized in South Africa, and so our collaboration with sex worker movement is around the ongoing lobbying to decriminalize sex work in South Africa. So that is one way in which, we can work together with the sex worker movement. This year, my organization had a autumn feminist school, which we call after a season in the year, and it was really a space where we could unpack what intersectionality meant. We had representation from queer women, HIV positive women, young women, and rural women, where we had a 1-week school where we came together and talked about, what are the issues affecting, what do we think should be points of advocacy, what do we think, other ways in which we can work together in future engagement. In the space, we also have men coming to present on the intersectionality between the issues facing trans men and how they often intersect with women's health issues, particularly around gynecological cancers, etc. We also worked with a feminist formation from West Africa called JANG, Akima Habas, in which we developed a feminist manual that we are aiming to use and implement at grassroots level to start conscientizing, to shift the discourse, and for us to be able to use feminism as a framework for our advocacy.
Okay. Leanne, do you have another minute? Do you want to talk about some of the gaps that exist and how to bridge that? So with any movement that you've sensed, even if it means the mainstream feminist movement, if it means the health movement, whichever movement, or maternal health, wherever you think, if there are any gaps, and some suggestions on how to bridge it.
One of the major gaps is that when we talk about trans health, it's a lot around it being seen as something special, when all it really is, and the of sexual and reproductive health rights for women in general. But it's always talked about, as a side issue, as something that stands out, as something special, as something out of the ordinary. I do believe some of the issues, some of the services that trans folk need can be taken up in some of the, health packages that are already in existence. That is one point of convergence where we can work with the public healthcare movement. I also would like for us to, start looking at, trans people and demographic characteristics, because those characteristics are missing in our advocacy. It's not brought to the table, and as it goes, if you you are not counted, you don't count. And so a lot of the times our issues fall through the cracks because they are not taken up, for example, in public health discourse around the development of demographic characteristics for trans folk to measure what is the prevalence, to measure, what are the health issues facing transgender people, and not for it to be looked as a special issue, but to be located in the broader context of sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Brilliantly, and I think you've really, really sort of told us a lot of things in a brief time. So not being counted when we're talking about there is violence against us. If you have a National Crime Records Bureau and they don't do a disability disaggregated data or trans persons disaggregate data, if they only say women, how are we going to lobby or advocate for change if we don't have the numbers, if we're not counted? We're pretty invisible in most of our senses globally, and then we all run to the World Bank and the WHO and their figures to quote them for our changes. The other thing which sort of was very important that stood out from your talk was also about treating this, so health services, for example, as a part of services for all. So when we say leaving no woman behind or leaving no one behind, as our SDGs say, are we really not leaving anyone behind is something that we all should think, because why do we then say that we want to fight for reproductive rights or sexual health of trans women, of women with disabilities, of intersex persons? Why? So those are some of the questions that we need to think, that when we say reproductive health for all women, it should mean all women. Thank you very much. Morgan, I would like to move to you, and if you could highlight some of the key debates that have been where movements have not been able to collaborate, and some of the victories or gaps in suggestions.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the points that you've raised, Leanne, as well. I think there are a couple of really wonderful victories, or small victories perhaps, that I would like to kind of celebrate with people. And one of them is last year Malta became the first country in the world to create in law a right to bodily integrity and physical autonomy. That does several things. One thing is that it prohibits the modification of children's sex characteristics for social or cultural reasons. But it also protects people from discrimination on grounds of gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. So it actually hits a number of key concerns that I think all of our populations face. And a second victory is in 2013 in Australia, we had a Senate, our upper house of Parliament, had an inquiry into involuntary or coerced sterilisation. And the inquiry was mainly about the involuntary or coerced sterilisation of people with disabilities. But the inquiry also looked at the involuntary or coerced sterilisation of intersex people. And it did that because of a nascent dialogue between disability organisations here and intersex organisations here. So being able to work together means that we can tackle all of our issues, and we've got some demonstrated examples of that, which is wonderful. When it comes to the challenges, I think there are plenty of them. And one of the most fundamental challenges from an intersex perspective is that almost everywhere in the world we're volunteers, and there are a very small number of organisations, intersex-led organisations, that employ staff, and maybe that's less than a handful of organisations still. So when it comes to actually networking, engaging in dialogue with other movements, most of us are doing that in our spare time. And that's kind of a very fundamental challenge that we face. But other challenges that we face, I mean, we tend to experience issues still about lack of comprehension, about a reductive analysis on gender identity issues when people talk about intersex, and difficulties in talking about bodies in the first place, which is one of the reasons why this webinar is so particularly welcome. And just to draw one aspect of that I think maybe illustrates some of the challenges. Together with the disability movement, we have to talk about stigma and the impact of stigma on eugenics, on prenatal selection against intersex traits, in the same way that there's prenatal selection on the basis of disabilities. And the big question is, how can we do that effectively? Talk about stigma at the same time that we protect people's right to abortion and to planned families. And there aren't any particularly good answers to that yet, other than to say that the issues are about stigma and discrimination and a very poor understanding of the reality of people's lives. And the fact that people with intersex traits, like people with disabilities, can live happy, fulfilling lives. So I think there are plenty of issues there, perhaps. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Morgan. I just feel that every time we're sort of bringing up new things, but also circling back to the older ones, where we're saying that there is a discomfort in talking about bodies, but particularly about bodies that don't fit, because the whole movements that we started are claiming our body, claiming our sexuality, and that was one of the bases of the women's rights movement. But really, are we comfortable talking about bodies that don't fit? Are we interested in talking about them is something that we need to look at. I mean, I could be, which I am a disability and gender rights activist, but am I then also even considering thinking about trans activism or activism that or movement that intersex people are working with? So really our interest, and then that ties very well into stigma, but I would also expand it into ignorance and stigma both, because when you don't engage, there is a lot of ignorance, and when there is ignorance, stigma perpetuates very, very simply. So and that's one of the reasons where we've spoken about forced sterilization. If a non-disabled heterosexual fitting into every sort of normative box, if a woman like that was forcefully sterilized, that would be a real sparking issue. Is that kind of importance given when women with disabilities or intersex women or trans women are sterilized or face a similar violence on their body? Okay, I want to just take that abortion piece slightly ahead and invite Janet now to give her comments. I mean, I'm not restricting you to that intersection and the friction in that space, but I would also request you to include that in your comment.
Okay,
or
thank
address
you.
that.
I've really enjoyed the last sets of comments from Adriana and Leanne and Morgan. I think it's brought up so many issues. One of the things that's really interested me is that leading up to the AWID conference, there's been all of the anxiety about Zika, and that was one of the reasons it was cancelled and has been postponed until the coming months. And one of the consequences of that is that some of the feminist members of the disability community, various groups, together with reproductive rights and sexual rights activists, have got together and really had a conversation about disability rights, women's rights over her body, and abortion, and how you handle those issues. They've put together a blog which really explores some of that, explores the conflicting and different perspectives that those rights groups are coming from, and looked at ways in which you can handle that and ways in which you can take the debate forward so that it's not always seen as one of conflict, but actually becomes one of creative engagement. So I think that's been really positive, and it's a blog that I'd really encourage you to dig out from amongst the many wonderful things that are coming out of in the pre-AWID days. You know, and I think that marks possibly a new move in bringing together those debates between reproductive rights and disability rights activists, because it has been a thorn of contention, and it's been one of the reasons that disability rights or women disability rights activists have felt so uncomfortable in much of the women's movement, because they felt that no concern has been given to that whole eugenic case for just aborting any female fetus that shows signs of having disability traits. So that was one issue that came forward. One of the things I've been very involved in doing over the years, and that I think I've seen expanding within the women's movement, has been really working to build links between feminist and disability rights groups. And I've worked a lot with CREA, the Indian-based global rights group, and they have run a whole series of courses, and I think one of the ones that I think probably has brought together most people across movements has been their online course on disability, sexuality and rights. And that's been great, because it's seen people from across the globe, from each of those different movements and in a whole range of from a different context, actually talking, learning from each other about, we've looked at sexual and reproductive rights, we've looked at representation, we've looked at violence, we've looked at the different models that we're working with, and we've done a lot to really try and encourage groups to put forward very particular demonstrations of the work that they've been doing, and that's been everything from work with women with intellectual disabilities and how you go about doing education work with them around the specificities of their bodies, to the beginnings of disability porn and what that might look like and how you might engage with it. So I think that has had all sorts of spread outs, and what I've seen coming from that is lots of inter-movement engagement between people and the building of new advocacy links within anti-violence, pro-womenist, pro-reproductive rights movements for women. So there's been, you know, major moves that way. Just very briefly, I wanted to sort of turn back to what Leanne was talking about in terms of sex workers. And one of the things that struck me most powerfully, I've been working with a group of African organisations who are trying to set up a coalition of disability rights and sexual rights groups to actually work and exchange ideas, information, advocacy, support. And one of the issues that came up around that was some sex workers in Kenya, disabled sex workers, and the way in which they were completely excluded and felt fearful to be a part of any movement at all. They economically very deprived, didn't want to belong to the disability movement because they didn't feel it belonged, didn't want to belong to the sexual rights movement because they didn't feel they belonged. And I think there's an enormous amount, when I was listening to Leanne talking about advocacy, affirmation, the ways in which they've worked with sex workers, I think there's a great deal that we could learn and take from her, because the disability movement is a very conservative movement. So there's a lot, it doesn't want to address sexuality as a whole. Within it, there's lots of people who do, but broadly, it doesn't want to. Right. I think I should let you do.
So, Janet, I think the thread that runs across for me with what Leanne said, Morgan said, and you said, and probably Adriana will say it as well, is really about carrying those stigmas, right? So when we say people carry stigma about us, somewhere our movements carry stigma too about other movements. And that's something that that I particularly have found challenging even within our work. So when I was co-authoring this website, researching and co-authoring a website for Point of View and CREA, two organizations based in India. So just for the benefit of everyone, just giving the URL here, it's called sexualityanddisability.org. Where the impact a little more, and I'm taking the privilege of a moderator to point one more thing, saying, could you please elaborate on these intersections of maybe more the violence movement, the fight against violence and disability. Also, if you have any thoughts on the health movement and disability, because from what Janet said, and some of the thoughts that I have is I mean, I will frame it after you share, but if you could say something around that, because we have a lot of research saying that violence is evident on people with disability. It does exist. If you see a bunch of Human Rights Watch reports across countries, across the globe, you will see that. So, Adriana, if you could tell us more, and some, if you've seen some contentions while collaborating with other movements, or some positives and way forward.
Vejamos, em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de falar que me tocou muito a fala do colega a respeito da fragilidade do intersex. Antes de entrar propriamente no tema, eu gostaria de falar só um passo sobre essa questão, que no Brasil nós não temos uma legislação isso. E a maior... Ok, tá baixo, tá melhor agora? Melhorou? No Brasil, nós não temos legislação sobre intersexualidade. E é tratado como doença rara. Eu acho isso um absurdo enorme.
Sorry, but I can't hear her.
Você consegue traduzir?
Adriana, could you come to... Yeah, now you're better.
Não quero. Veja, no Brasil, é tratado como doença rara a intersexualidade. Eu acho isso um absurdo. Está conseguindo traduzir, Kel?
So now it's okay, Adriana. In Brazil, we don't have a specific laws for intersexuality. So in Brazil, this issue is considered a rare disease.
Que é um absurdo. E me toca muito a fragilidade desses corpos, né? Todos esses corpos, o corpo da deficiência, do transgênero, esses corpos tidos como desviantes e, portanto, corpos que são estigmatizados e sujeitos à discriminação, eles são corpos que precisam de muita proteção social.
So these sort of bodies that are quite, they have quite stigma. They need a lot of social protection.
E aqui no Brasil a gente tem tentado fazer um trabalho, tentando trazer aspectos positivos para a dinâmica social desses corpos. Então, por exemplo, a gente tem tentado desenvolver o aspecto do assistente erótico para as pessoas com deficiência, mas tem sido muito difícil o embate com os conservadores.
Sorry. So we have tried to bring the positive aspects of this body, and we have tried to develop this sort of erotic supporter to these people.
Mas tem sido difícil o embate com os conservadores. Por exemplo, há um debate sobre os devotees, que são as pessoas que desejam as pessoas com deficiência, e os conservadores acham eles pervertidos, acham uma perversão, e eu defendo que é político positivo, porque se há pessoas que nos desejam, nós temos corpos desejáveis. Mas tem sido extremamente difícil esse embate.
But it's quite hard to face the conservative people, because they don't allow us to live this with freedom. Yes, sorry.
Grande dificuldade em falar de violência contra essas pessoas no Brasil.
We don't get to talk about violence against these people in Brazil.
Por exemplo, quando houve o atentado no Japão, no dia 26 de julho,
when happened that issue in Japan in July 26th,
a imprensa local silenciou, quase não se falou sobre a morte das pessoas com deficiência na clínica de cuidados.
The local media simply silenced. They didn't talk about what happened with the people with disability in that clinic.
Eu escrevi um artigo para a revista na qual eu sou articuladora.
I wrote an article for the magazine that I coordinate.
E esse artigo foi bastante comentado, circulou bastante. Mas houve muito pouco comentário além do meu artigo. A grande imprensa nacional não falou.
The mainstream media didn't talk about. Only my article and a few other comments.
E parece que isso aconteceu no mundo inteiro, né? Quer dizer, se morre gente em Paris, se as outras comunidades de pessoas morrem, parece que há um grande luto. O que é importante, claro que é importante, mas se pessoas com deficiência morrem, há um silêncio.
And I think that this happened in the whole world when other sort of communities have problems, face issues. If some of them die, the whole world face grief. But when it's about disability people, the same doesn't happen.
E aí alguém comentou que a eugenia está de volta. E aí eu comento no meu artigo, não, ela não está de volta, ela nunca foi embora.
And someone said that eugenia is back. And I said, no, eugenia never left us.
Desde a Action T4 do nazismo até o atentado do Japão, nunca deixamos de ter uma eugenia. Né? Pessoas com corpos desviantes sempre foram estigmatizadas.
Since Nazism, we never left eugenia. People with a deviant body, with a stigma, they always faced these sort of issues.
Então é preciso sistematicamente lutar contra a violência, denunciá-la. Né? Aqui no Brasil, essa denúncia é constante, embora no presente momento eu não tenha grandes esperanças. O movimento que vivemos no Brasil hoje é um movimento muito sem esperança, devido ao ataque democrático.
So we need systematically denounce this sort of violence, but at this moment in Brazil, I don't have hope because of the sort of political moment that we face in the the attack against the democratic system that we face now.
Okay, last 1 minute to wrap up your thought, Adriana, and it might be also interesting to hear when you said you were the only one who wrote an article on it, and you got some comments. What were the comments like? If you could end with that, then we can just start our Q&A session. Hello? Adriana? Yeah.
Então, como eu ia falando, nós temos feito algumas iniciativas importantes. No Ministério da Saúde, nós desenvolvemos a Política Nacional de Saúde para Mulheres com Deficiência, com combate à violência intraparejo, ou seja, dentro da família, fora da família, cuidado com viúvas, cuidado social, mas a questão é que, apesar do desenvolvimento da política, nós não temos nesse momento
She's talking about the national policy that was created, what is already a sort of success, but we still face a huge challenge for implement this policy. I just need a minute to translate to her your question. Adriana? Adriana? Adriana?
Tô ouvindo.
Adriana, ela pediu para você fazer um último comentário sobre os comentários que você recebeu por ocasião do artigo que você escreveu, para você fechar com isso.
Ah, tá certo, tá.
Ok. Então, pode falar. You can talk.
Eu recebi muitos comentários a respeito da importância de divulgarmos o que aconteceu no Japão como uma sinalização da dor das pessoas com deficiência de todo mundo. Me pareceu muito emblemático.
I received a lot of comments about the importance of showing the pain of the people with disabilities with what happened in Japan.
Me pareceu muito emblemático a tentativa de assassinato em massa ter acontecido no aniversário do ato americano de pessoas com deficiência.
It was quite emblematic, the murder in mass that happened there. It happens in the same day of Afro-American celebration. Adriana, can you repeat, please? Pode repetir, Adriana.
O ato americano de pessoas com deficiência. Foi no aniversário do ato de pessoas americanas.
So it happened in the same period of the American Act for People with Disabilities.
Okay. Thank you so much, and that answers one of our questions. So one of our participants had put the question of the Japan the mass killing that happened on people with disabilities, and the question was really which lives matter, and we've been discussing that, saying really which lives matter is something that all of us should reflect on. Because we're clearly somewhere carrying the stigma through the mainstream media and otherwise are giving out messages that some lives matter and some don't. A very quick example here, which I will be writing in my next article, is also about when we talk about violence. There was a huge gang rape story in India a couple of years ago, which was highlighted, which provoked in protests, anger, fury, and rightly so, because it was really, really brutal violence, beyond sort of any violence is not humane, but this was really, really beyond. And it became a word in international media, in international, everybody sort of globally heard about it, thought about it. And a similarly brutal rape of a woman with an intellectual disability happened a year and a half later, and that did not elicit the same response for people. So really the question remains of which lives matter. I will quickly now request all the panelists, I will shoot one question to one person. Sorry for randomly choosing this, because we're running really out of time, and if you could keep your responses very brief but also to the point. One of the questions here is by Sheena, and I think I'll put it to Leanne here. So she asks, saying, how do we create a space for real intersectionality in the whole phase of serious resource constraints, because she's convinced that the silos exist primarily to create exceptional circumstances, more resources for certain movements and less resources for certain others. So I think this question I'll leave open for whoever would like to answer, but yeah, any two of you who would like to take this question up.
You can go, Morgan.
Morgan, you've been nominated to answer this question.
I'm not sure how to answer the question, really. The question of resourcing is such a frustrating question, really. And I wish there were clear answers and clear solutions to the question of how resources are allocated and how the situation can change. I mean, I'd ask people that are listening to the webinar to question funders who work on disability issues, on women's issues, on LGBT issues, and try and encourage funders of those movements to fund the intersex movement as well, and to fund cross-movement work as well, and fund ways in which people can come together and talk about, issues around the body and stigma and discrimination and violence. And I just want to follow up as well what Adriana was saying about the Japanese incident. It's horrific, and it hasn't had as much press as other incidents which are seen as being more newsworthy because they point to other forms of violence that are more interesting to the media. So I don't know, on funding, it's frustrating. It seems like it's a long thing to change, and from my point of view as an intersex activist, trying to make a case for funding in the first place is so challenging with the resource limitations that we start from. So,
can I also respond to that, Nidhi?
Yes, please, Leanne, feel free.
I just wanted to say, yeah, I acknowledge that resources remain a very challenged issue. But I also wanted to reiterate that, sometimes there are spaces created for us to dialogue. But I think a lot of times, a lot of us are so overburdened with dealing with the issues within our movements, with trying to maintain a sense of health and well-being, and just trying to sustain our movements and our organization, that often we forget about the ways in which our issues intersect, and making room to discuss those intersections. And one thing that that I have noticed on the African continent, we have these conferences that we go to, and a lot of the time, feminist work and women's work are always relegated to someone's bedroom at night to have the conversations, and there's never meaningful inclusion within the program of the of whatever platform we are going to. And so that is something that has become unusually frustrating to me, because I mean, where are the spaces for women to dialogue? Where are the places where we can engage with other feminists to learn and share? And I'll make an example. On the PI conference, and the Pan-Africa ILGA conference that we had a women's space. We had certain outcomes in mind. We didn't reach those outcomes because the boiling point became about this group of women versus that group of women, and we never really even got to discuss intersectionality, which was really, really sad to me.
So I think funding is a complex issue, and there is no one right answers. It can't be completely that the silos are created for funding opportunities, because clearly when we talk about the intersex movement, there is no funding coming through as much as some other movements were in silos, etc. So it is a complex, and I like Morgan's suggestion of finding out from funders, because it is sort of things that we need to really think about or invest a little more in terms of agenda, in terms of what's the power of pushing a movement above the other and why is someone exercising that. Okay, quickly to combine two questions from Yvette and Sanjana, and I'll put that to Janet, is about this connection between the mind and body. So to engage a little bit more with the mental health. So one of them asks, Yvette asks that there is a whole, when you're not gender non-conforming, when your identity is not normative, quote unquote, it does impact your mental health, and then people strive very hard to not be called the crazy person. So where is some of the space to talk about this kind of emotional disability or mental health, as the participants have put it?
Thank you for that. I think that's an absolutely crucial question. I was just sitting with a friend yesterday who is getting older, who is losing her mobility, and who is filled with such grief about the loss of that mobility and about what her future life will hold. And I think, across the world, women who've had active, effective lives are beginning to face increasing disability from age. They're facing the stresses and the discrimination that comes against old age people. And I think we need to move beyond the shame we feel. Again, it's shame that comes up so powerfully in talking about the ways in which we feel we are possibly falling apart, possibly sinking under the grief that we feel that we are no longer the person we hoped we would be, or the person that others expect us to be. It's the way that these idealized norms have such a power over us, and that we set hierarchies within movements, we set hierarchies in our own minds about what the right ways of being are, and we have to try and find ways of being more open about this, being open about the guilt we feel as well as the shame, and I think just talking more honestly amongst ourselves. But I think also within the disability movement, one of the difficulties, one of the figures that really always strikes me is that the biggest disability is depression. Internationally, there is no larger illness right across the board, physical and psychosocial. That is the one that affects most people. And yet it gets so little financing, so little recognition, and we are all so scared of it. And as you say, we get very scared of this title of being the mad or the crazy one. So I think a lot more education, a lot more honesty, a lot fewer hierarchies, and I think an openness, as much as anything, start talking amongst friends. I find that, start with the people around you, because I think very often you'll find that many of the people who seem to be, living these really high-powered, effective, wonderful lives are actually facing enormous mind-body challenges. And I think we need to begin to move away from thinking there is an idealized body over here that we're aiming for, and then there are these broken bodies and minds over here that we need to run away from, and actually beginning to see much more variety, and to accept and be open to some of those very different and, yes, at times difficult, but also enormously creative ways of being. I mean, one of the things, just on a personal level, that I've had to deal with my illness is that I've gone through, with my disability, I've gone through numerous periods. I've been fairly stable, and then I've had a big dip, and I've lost a lot of physical function. And then I've hit another stable place, and they've had another big dip. So I've had to keep going through these periods of grief and loss at the things I can no longer do, and then find a new way of being. And every time that's been a struggle, but every time I've found a new equilibrium. And I think it's about finding those places within our lives that give us some sense of hope and support, but that move us away from thinking perfect ways of being.
Thank you.
I'll shut.
That's brilliant. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I said enough. I can bang on forever about this because I feel very passionate about it.
Because it's closing time, but because we started 3 or 4 minutes late, I'm going to take 5 minutes more. Put the last question to Adriana, and then quickly close the last 2 minutes. Sorry, participants, we will not be able to take all the questions, but I'm hoping that we've covered most of the issues that you've raised. One thing that just what Janet said, and again, the privilege of a moderator to add, is really thinking about various hierarchies. So hierarchies across movements, hierarchies within movements as well. Within disability rights, there is an unspoken hierarchy between different disabilities. When you're on a spectrum, gender spectrum, transition spectrum, there is a hierarchy within that. So really looking at hierarchies across and within. Thank you so much, Janet. Adriana, the question for you is that in many cultural, religious, political contexts, SRHR, so sexual and reproductive rights or health and rights, is already a very, very contentious issue to begin with. It becomes very, 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 much more complex when we're talking about disability. What would you suggest to advocate on the implementation of the existing policies or frameworks, at least as a starting point? If you could translate for Adriana, please.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Adriana,
diga.
Ela falou nessa questão da limitação religiosa que existem para muitas questões e mais ainda para a questão da desabilidade, né, da deficiência. E o que você sugere de política que possa ser implementado?
Pode dar conta disso, né? Veja, aqui no Brasil, eu percebo assim, que o movimento da pessoa com deficiência, ele é muito tomado pela religiosidade. Inclusive, muitas ONGs que são coordenadas por religiões ou por entidades religiosas. Comecemos por aí.
So here in Brazil, the movement of for the rights for disability is really coordinated for religious movement. The main NGOs and so on, they are coordinated for religious movement.
Então isso dificulta muito tanto o debate sobre sexualidade como interações com o Intersex, o movimento de LGBT, movimento de feminismo. Isso já dificulta, em princípio, essas questões.
So this dificults a lot the interaction with other movements, the feminist movements, the intersection movements, transgenders, and so on.
Né? A ONG Essas Mulheres é a única ONG brasileira que é feminista por princípio, para vocês terem ideia. A única ONG brasileira que é feminista é a Essas Mulheres.
So Essas Mulheres, the NGO, is the unique one, is the only one that is considered really feminist for women with disabilities.
E nós temos tido muitas dificuldades, nós somos muito caluniadas, porque dizem que nós queremos perverter as mulheres com deficiência, enfim.
So yeah, we face a lot of difficulties, a lot of sort of discrimination. They say that we are perverted, this sort of thing.
Dizem que nós queremos perverter os anjinhos com deficiência intelectual, fazê-los sexuais, como se sexuais eles já não fossem.
They say that we want to pervert the sort of angels with intellectual disability, this sort, yeah.
I just wonder if you could translate, Adriana, where, so the point was that how would you then in such a climate, would you be able to talk about sexual rights at all? Are there any if not national, international policies or frameworks that you can start drawing upon and implementing?
Adriana,
o mais... diga.
Ela está pedindo para você falar sobre a questão dos direitos sexuais, se já tem algum marco político.
Não, não existe nenhum marco político. Nós estamos tentando o marco político dos assistentes eróticos, né? O aborto no Brasil só é permitido em caso de estupro e em caso de ameaça à morte, em caso de grave ameaça à saúde da mãe. Então, nós não temos direito a isso. Os evangélicos estão fortemente munidos para impedir, inclusive em caso de Zika.
So we don't have any sort of a political framework in Brazil that can protect these people, that can protect disability people. And even now, we face a really strong resistance of evangelical people that are in the politics that don't allow any sort of advance in this field.
Okay, so Adriana, I think with that valuable thought and that again opens a Pandora's box for discussion, but we will end the webinar here. I'd like to just make one sort of comment here around SRHR implementations. Like Adriana said, there are situations of religious fundamentalism, groups that are sort of monitoring various movements, are filtering out. There are other political, cultural issues because of which sexual rights cannot be advanced, and find it very, very challenging, I think, to really collaborate then with other movements and to really understand the work. So if you want to talk about sexual rights of persons with disabilities, to collaborate with this SRHR movement itself, to collaborate with women's rights movement and talk about sexuality. So those are some little steps that one can take to start basic implementation of national and international policy frameworks. A big thank you to all our panelists. It's been an extremely rich, diverse, and valuable 2 hours with you. We do not have a time to do a summary, but I also think that we've brought many more issues than one can summarize in a matter of a couple of minutes here. So thank you for your valuable time. Thank you for your valuable inputs. All the participants who are listening to us, thank you very much for joining and actively interacting with us through your questions, accessing this space for discourses. Thank you very much, AWID. Thank you, CREA, and all the partners who've helped AWID organize this webinar. And for everyone, once again, we look forward to the Bodily Integrity umbrella theming session at AWID, and we will continue our pre-forum interactions through webinars, articles, blogs, and see you all hopefully at the AWID Forum. Thank you, everyone. Thanks from India. This is Nidhi Goel signing off.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
just
Thank you.
last thanks to Nidhi too for moderating, and again to all the panelists. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, or morning, evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne.